Hello everybody, welcome to my talk. What we really take with us, the untold costs of personal game development as a labor of love. My name's Adam Jerrett, as you can see, and I'm from the University of Portsmouth, although I hail from South Africa, and I know we've got a couple of South Africans in the audience, which makes my heart happy. Cool, so I wanted to start this talk off by having a brief kind of broader discussion around these kinds of very nebulous terms that we talk about, even as we talk about things like ethical games and ethical game design. Because all of these things, in my mind, are a little bit related. So we have ethics, which are kind of philosophical frameworks for deciding what's right and wrong, and often that's at like quite large scale level. And then we have morals, which are our personal beliefs on what is right and wrong based on those frameworks, our culture, our upbringing, and a bunch of other stuff like that. But then more importantly to me, as a values conscious game designer, I like values. Values are basically the things we care about as people. And a lot of those things guide our principles and standards for how we kind of move about the world, right, and guide our behavior. Those are sometimes obviously influenced by moral and ethical frameworks as well. But that's really important because oftentimes I find that oftentimes when we're talking about ethics and morals in games specifically, we're actually talking about values and people's individual values in what they value in games and all these kinds of things. And then finally, politics, which is the other thing that the media loves to talk about in terms of games, are the ideologies that individuals kind of ascribe themselves to that most closely resemble their own values, and obviously they use that as sort of collective bargaining towards changes in power and resources and stuff. So yeah, really important to kind of put that all up front, primarily because a lot of my talk here today is going to revolve around sort of values and value-centric design. All of this stuff that we've been talking about for the last hour and a half. Ethics in the games industry is increasingly important. All of these things, unfortunately, in the last year have kind of been real hot button issues, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of people kind of having discussions about that over the next 2 days. Yeah, really interesting. But interestingly, indie development kind of doesn't have a lot of those discussions going on. Some of them certainly are, especially things like generative AI at the moment is a big kind of question mark around independent development. But indie development generally tends to be quite evangelized as this amazing thing where like you just have all this passion and with a bit of luck, you make this game that you love and is your baby, and you will release it into the world and it'll do a Super Meat Boy or a Minecraft or a insert indie game here and make bajillions of dollars, and everything will be happy. Now that, of course, comes with its own ethical considerations, like, for example, how do developers in struggling economies get access to hardware to make stuff? So in South Africa, for example, that's a big deal. And then kind of tangential to that, you have personal games, which is this idea around making independent games that speak to something about a developer's personal experience. And that's becoming a growing thing within independent development. It's cool because it kind of aligns a bit with auteur theory from film, this idea that like outside of like player-centric stuff, and we'll hear a lot about player-centric design, I'm sure, across the next 2 days, because it's obviously one of the dominant approaches to game design. This idea that like we're building it for the player. No, when you're making a personal game, primarily you're kind of building it to an extent for yourself, because the process of making the game is the thing that creates meaning. So within that, you have a lot of research that's been done around personal game development, both by academia and within the industry, around the sort of benefits of making personal games. So primarily one of the big ones that I think is probably the most important, especially as it kind of relates to equity and equality, is this idea of like making personal games is a nice in for people who don't consider themselves to be developers to start making games. Everyone can be a game developer, I always say. So like you can use really easy development tools like Bitsy or Twine, unlike stuff like Unity or Unreal Engine or a variety of other kind of more hardcore game engines, to make something sort of quicker and simpler and ideally kind of inspired by your own personal experience, as like you don't have to think about the game you're going to make. The game you can make is the thing that's part of your own experience. And there's been a lot of things like game jams that have made this really popular within academic circles. A lot of research has been done around sort of the game design process within the personal context, being a very therapeutic process because like it's reflective because you have to think about the thing you're trying to make. It's social because it's when you're doing things like game jams, you're doing it in a social environment. You have to abstract the experience, which kind of helps you deal with the thing. And also you're learning new skills, especially for people who aren't kind of thoroughbred game developers, as it were. And this kind of ties into the idea of what Toft and Hara call design bleed, which is just this idea of allowing your life and the game you're making to blur in some interesting way. And then you also have the industry who can kind of talk, who kind of various developers and indie devs have spoken over the years around this idea of personal games being a way to explore both positive life experiences and negative ones. Oftentimes, many personal games deal specifically with negative life experiences because it's kind of the low-hanging fruit to an extent. And specifically, it shows players that they're not alone, which is really important because you want to make something that goes out into the world and shows people that like, hey, I've had this experience too. Lots of successful examples in that regard, even though some of them are really difficult to play. That Dragon Cancer, for example, Sibel by Nina Freeman, and then obviously, and more recently, there's a cool game called Venba, if you haven't played it, about kind of being an immigrant and like food culture and stuff, which is really interesting. So all of that sounds great, cool. Making personal games is going to be great. It's going to be a great time. So that's what I did. What we take with us is the game that I made. I've got links to it later on in the presentation. But it's interesting because it's not your typical game. It's what I termed a poly-pervasive game. So it's kind of a pervasive game or a real-world game in a variety of different formats. Which is kind of similar to kind of transmedia storytelling, people are aware of that. But essentially, it's a game you play in real life, but there are kind of multiple formats of it that present various different experiences. The one format was an online alternate reality game. So you kind of spoke to a character and stuff. I've got pictures in the next slide. The other one was this kind of physical room-based game that was kind of inspired by escape rooms, but isn't really an escape room because I took out the escaping from the escape room. So I guess it's just a room. And then I also did some game-based workshops based on the kind of prompts that the game gives you, because that's the way it's designed, that can allow kind of well-being stuff. And that was the point of the game. The game was kind of supposed to be this exploration of well-being. For me, at a time, I was designing it during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was a very reflective experience on the COVID-19 environment. And it kind of has players complete a bunch of quite sort of generic-ish, but still pretty cool wellness tasks. And it's really interesting, and hold it in your mind that the game is about well-being, because that's going to come in clutch in a second. So there's some game formats. There was an ARG, it was played on Discord, and it also has some YouTube stuff by a character. There was the room-based game, which was like a little room that you'd go into and then you would play the game tasks in the room. And there was also a digital game and workshops based on the digital game. Like I said, there is a URL for the website that is basically the entire game. I'll pop up at the end of the presentation. This talk generally is kind of about what I learned through the process. So I used a variety of methodologies for this because I am an academic, even though I'm also a designer and a developer of games as well. So I used research through design. So I made a thing to see what I could find out. And then in studying it, because it was an ARG, and kind of all of these were real world games, I had, oh, my TV is talking to me, good times. I used autoethnography because I was there and I could observe the process of people playing the game. And indeed, I could play it myself while it was running. And then to look at player responses, I used narrative inquiry, which is interesting. So what did I learn from the process? Turns out, in terms of creation, it was really hard. Turns out making a COVID game in COVID, it's kind of a bit of an emotional roller coaster for a variety of reasons. One of them obviously being sort of the content and the context of the game. I'm like diving into my deepest psychological things around COVID to make this game. So that in itself was quite emotionally trying, and there was a lot of emotional labor involved. But there were also a bunch of things around things like, oh, the pandemic's not over yet. How are we going to make a room when everybody needs to be socially distancing? And we don't know if we can make games in physical spaces anymore. And then I think one of the most important things that I'll come on to later as well is this idea that I made this game alone because it was a personal game and like personal me developer making stuff. Making a game alone has a variety of specific challenges to it that obviously we can talk about in a second, but I'm conscious of time. Making the game itself was really difficult, just forcing myself to sit down and write the narrative some days was just tough because my mental health took a beating throughout the entire pandemic, as many people's did. And it was a tough time. And this is really interesting because this starts to foreshadow this idea that, like, hey, maybe personal game design is not all sunshine and roses, as everybody in terms of the literature kind of seemed to expect in a variety of ways. And then deployment kind of got a bit worse because I made this game, and I made this personal game. It's a game that you can go and play, and then nobody played it. And with pervasive games specifically, this is really kind of a finicky thing because pervasive games typically have a bit of a time limit. They're kind of deployed into the world and usually study it over a period of time. And I had a whole lot of problems just getting people to play my game over what was basically a 3-month period. There were a lot of questions around whether or not real world games made sense in the current climate. Some of that was like in a post-COVID world, like what do real world games look like in a post-COVID world? Some of it looks like it was a game about COVID that was deployed in early 2023. So like we were sort of post-pandemic at that point. So we need to start thinking about that as developers as well. What do our games look like in a post-pandemic world? And all of this kind of failure, it wasn't really failure, but it felt like it at the time, really led to this really profound sense of imposter syndrome. Why am I doing this? Am I making a difference? Because again, that was the point of the game, right? It's supposed to be a well-being game. It's supposed to make a difference. Was anything I did worth it in the end? And this is kind of juxtaposed against the idea that, like, for a lot of pervasive games, stuff like escape rooms, you have a lot of physical labor involved in the process. You have to like reset the room after every playthrough. There's a lot of emotional labor involved, specifically within this study, because it was a well-being focused game. So I was debriefing participants when they were done. It was really draining. The whole process of like deploying it and sort of studying it was really, really draining. And that was hard. And it's important because you'll see at the end, a big part of this talk is about, let's talk about the hard parts of this kind of stuff. But then it turned out at the end, in terms of reportage, that everybody loved it. The people who played it anyway, loved it. There were some really cool anecdotes. So one person, one of the members of the development team, one of the actors that I hired to play a character, I classed them on the development team. They had this like really amazing kind of epiphany about sort of changing their entire career trajectory. Oh, sorry, I've got some gain questions. It's because I'm loud and the mic is picking me up. So yeah, they changed their entire career trajectory after kind of being with me on this journey and playing the game themselves. They changed like a lot of the narrative stuff, made them think about their grandfather, and they ended up like changing career paths entirely and like becoming a plasterer, which is cool. And then a bunch of the players generally had a variety of different game-specific examples for what worked specific to them and what didn't work. So ultimately, the reportage of the game was very different from what I experienced when developing it, which is that like everybody kind of loved it and it was good in what it needed to be. And what that kind of says to me is that here, the developer experience is definitely not necessarily what the player experience is going to be. So that led me to this little research question, which is, what ethical considerations exist when creating personally situated pervasive game projects, or just generally, how can we make this more sustainable? And I thought about a bunch of things that we can do to potentially make this kind of personal game development sustainable. I won't go through all of them for time's sake, but a couple of them I want to highlight here. Number one, be prepared for the fact that like it's going to be really emotionally challenging throughout the process. I don't think a lot of the literature talked about that as I was going into it. I thought it would be fine. It was not in some cases. So that's one of the important ones. Collaboration is another really, really important one. Don't do this alone, which again is weird when you consider the term personal game development, personal yourself. But if you have a team, that helps a lot in sharing the creative and sort of personal emotional burden. Even if you do that collaboration remotely, like I did. Take care of yourself. Take breaks where you need to. Make sure your physical, mental, and emotional health are on point. And kind of in that same breath, establish support processes for the expected labor of your game before you start the project. If you think having a therapist on hand might be helpful for members of your team, for example, getting that stuff set up if you know you're going to go into a project that is going to be particularly emotionally charged is really, really important. Other stuff, the game is distinct from you or your experience. So the game that I made is not me. When people don't play my game, it doesn't mean that I'm a bad person. It means that they didn't want to or didn't like my game. And just remembering that is important, because when you're in the heat of it, it's really hard to remember those kinds of things. Consider your audience while you're designing. This, again, doesn't make sense given the notion that I was talking about around personal projects, and the fact that it's kind of very auteur driven. But like ultimately, your game is going to be played by people. So think about who those people might be, and consider it during design, even though a lot of your design can be wrapped up in the personal stuff. And then consider how being in a post-pandemic era, especially in this case, might affect your game, because I think that's going to be increasingly important going forward. And then ultimately, the process is still cathartic. It still lets you learn things. That was one thing the literature was particularly right about. And your game will reach an audience. Someone will play it, and someone will probably be happy that you've made the thing you've made, which again was really hard for me to internalize while I was making it, and was even really hard for me to internalize as people were telling me my game was good. And then lastly, and the most importantly, I think, talk about failures. We don't do this enough, certainly in academia. We like to talk about the fancy, shiny studies that do really well. We don't talk about studies that have potentially failed for a variety of reasons. And especially when you're talking about personal life experiences, that kind of communication generally is key on the whole. So yeah, last couple of slides. So this is a sample size of one, obviously, but that's fine. Most game design and development projects, it's important to remember, are bespoke. But like all game postmortems within the industry are, here's what we learned from making Grand Theft Auto 5. Here's what we learned from making Amnesia: Machine for Pigs. Just because those learnings are specific to that particular game doesn't mean that the learnings aren't valuable. So that's something to keep in mind. And then broadly, we need more robust frameworks, and that's what we're doing here at this conference, right? We're talking more about this kind of stuff. So I kind of gave a little bit of a framework in the previous slide, but like, what does that look like with traditional digital games? What does it look like for indie or AAA titles? How might those kinds of considerations affect larger team sizes? Again, I had a team size of 1 and kind of a half towards the end of the thing. And ultimately, the really important point is that, like, despite the fact that industry knowledge is like this idea that at some point you have to ship, the game's not going to ship if no one's left to complete it. So to take care of yourselves, everybody. Right. I think I did pretty admirably there. Those are some links if you want to get in touch with me. And I'll switch back to those links in a second. But if you want to quickly scan those to have a look at the website and stuff, and maybe play the games and bits and pieces like that, please do so. And yeah, otherwise we might have a little bit of time for questions. I don't know if Celia wants to potentially kick me off, so we can take a break. I'm not sure.
We need to finish that in 3 minutes, so we can have at least 5-minute break. So
Yeah, I mean, if there are any questions on the Q&A, I've kind of got it up if anybody has anything particular. Otherwise, thanks for listening. Hopefully, you learned some stuff.
yeah, thank you so much,
Cool.
Adam.